In 1981, the United States Army quietly ran a formal trial to find a replacement for its own aging M1911 pistol, collected the results, and then terminated the entire program the following February, claiming none of the submitted pistols actually met its own requirements, a decision announced with almost no accompanying explanation for a program that had already consumed considerable time and taxpayer money across an entire branch of the military. The Army released almost no details about what those requirements actually were or exactly how each pistol had actually performed under testing. To this day, the original test data from that specific trial remains either unavailable or genuinely lost, and more than one historian who has actually studied the episode closely has raised a genuinely uncomfortable question whether the Army had quietly designed its own secret trial specifically to fail in order to keep the beloved M1911 in service a while longer, rather than genuinely searching for the best possible replacement. This is the story of the Beretta M9, the pistol every American officer actually carried for more than 30 years, and the genuinely contested, occasionally suspicious path the weapon actually took before the Army ever formally adopted it at all. Every week we take apart the story stamped on the receiver of an American firearm, the designers, the soldiers, and the decisions that built a legend or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The search for a genuine M1911 replacement actually began under Air Force rather than Army leadership, with the Joint Service Small Arms Program running its own formal trials, starting in the late 1970s, specifically to identify a modern 9mm pistol capable of meeting NATO standardized ammunition requirements. The aging point, .45 caliber M1911 had never actually been designed around those requirements back when it first entered service decades earlier. In 1980, that same Air Force-led process selected a Beretta design over serious competition from Colt, Smith & Wesson, several separate Fabrique Nationale entries, and considerably more established European manufacturers who had genuinely expected their own submissions to actually stand a fair chance. The Army immediately challenged those results and demanded entirely new testing under its own direct authority instead, the first genuine sign of an institutional tug-of-war that would actually drag on for the following 5 years before any pistol finally reached official American service. Before we get into exactly what happened during that genuinely disputed 1981 Army trial, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The Army's own 1981 trial, run under its own direct control, after successfully wresting the program away from the Air Force, collected samples from 4 separate manufacturers, ran its own testing, and then simply terminated the entire program in February of 1982, declaring that none of the submitted pistols had actually met the Army's own requirements without ever publicly releasing meaningful detail about what those specific requirements actually were or how each individual pistol had actually performed against them. Congress and the wider American press pushed back hard against that same unusual secrecy. Genuine political pressure, building specifically because a major military procurement decision had apparently been made and then reversed with almost no public accountability behind either decision, and the resulting scrutiny eventually forced the Army to abandon its own contested results entirely and start the whole process over from scratch under considerably more transparent conditions. Historians who have since tried to actually reconstruct what happened during that specific episode have generally concluded the Army harbored a genuine institutional preference for simply converting its own existing M1911 pistols to 9mm rather than adopting an entirely new foreign or domestic design, a preference that may well have shaped how the Army's own supposedly objective 1981 testing was actually conducted in the first place. Whether through deliberate manipulation or simply an institutional bias nobody involved ever fully acknowledged at the time. A third, considerably more transparent round of trials, formally designated the XM9 program, finally ran through 1983 and 1984, open to manufacturers from the United States and abroad, and built around requirements deliberately written to be measured objectively against the known performance characteristics of the existing M1911 A1 rather than left open to the same kind of subjective interpretation that had already derailed the previous attempt entirely. By the end of that same extended process, only 2 genuine finalists actually remained: Beretta's own considerably refined 92 SBF and the SIG Sauer P226, both pistols performing close enough to each other that the Army's own final decision ultimately came down to price rather than any dramatic difference in actual battlefield performance. Beretta's own per-unit cost of roughly $230, considerably undercutting SIG Sauer's own roughly $500 bid for essentially comparable reliability and durability across every measured category. The Army officially announced its decision on April 10, 1985, adopting the Beretta design as the pistol, semi-automatic 9mm M9, with an initial contract for just over 315,000 pistols destined to arm American forces across every branch of service. That adoption proved genuinely controversial almost immediately, and not simply among traditionalists mourning the loss of the beloved M1911 and its own larger .45 caliber cartridge. Many soldiers had already grown genuinely attached to, across decades of continuous American military use. A genuine, documented, mechanical problem emerged shortly after the M9 actually entered widespread service, slides cracking, and in a small number of genuinely alarming incidents involving Navy Special Operations units firing considerably higher volumes of ammunition than an ordinary infantry soldier ever would across training and actual combat use combined, actually separating from the frame entirely during live fire. Beretta responded with a formal engineering fix, installing a larger hammer pin specifically designed to catch a cracked slide and prevent it from actually flying free toward the shooter's own face. A genuinely serious safety redesign for a weapon that had already been formally adopted as America's own standard sidearm barely 2 years earlier, and that needed correcting quickly before the controversy actually threatened the entire program. The specific testing conditions, the XM9 trials, actually put every competing pistol through deserved, genuine attention in their own right, since the Army had deliberately designed the process to be considerably more demanding than any routine peacetime evaluation might otherwise have required. Pistols faced full submersion in mud for a full 60 seconds, followed immediately by live firing without any cleaning whatsoever, extreme temperature cycling running from well below freezing to well above ordinary summer heat, and deliberate sand ingestion tests specifically designed to simulate exactly the kind of harsh desert and coastal environments American forces might realistically deploy into. Every competing pistol needed to demonstrate a minimum service life of 5,000 rounds, fired with no more than 8 total malfunctions across that same extended testing window, a genuinely demanding standard considering how few American handgun buyers, military or civilian, ever actually fire anywhere close to that many rounds through a single pistol across its own entire working lifetime. That specific combination of environmental abuse and sheer volume endurance testing meant the Beretta design's own eventual victory reflected genuine, comprehensive engineering validation rather than any single narrow performance metric cherry-picked to favor one particular manufacturer over its own competitors. Here is what actually gets lost in most casual retellings of this same controversy. Buried underneath the more dramatic headlines, the slide-cracking incidents actually generated at the time. Formal testing data from the original XM9 trials themselves tells a genuinely different story than the M9's own occasionally rocky early reputation might suggest to anyone only familiar with the weapon through its own more sensational controversies. The Beretta design achieved a mean rounds between failure rate of approximately 2,000 rounds during its own reliability testing compared to roughly 1,000 rounds for the SIG Sauer entry, and considerably more strikingly, only around 500 rounds for the incumbent M1911A1 it was actually meant to replace after decades of continuous prior service. That specific comparison means the pistol popular gun culture has spent decades occasionally mocking as an inferior downgrade from the beloved M1911 actually tested by the Army's own official measurements, roughly 4 times more reliable than the weapon it replaced. A genuinely inconvenient fact for anyone still nostalgic for the exact pistol the Army had already spent years quietly trying to keep in service, rather than replace it all through its own earlier, considerably less transparent testing process. Congress forced one further round of testing in 1988, the XM10 program, specifically to determine whether a genuinely superior alternative might still exist now that the M9 had already accumulated several years of genuine field experience. Submissions arrived from Smith & Wesson, Ruger, Tenfoglio, and Browning, each company hoping to capitalize on the M9's early controversies and displace it before the design had fully proven itself in extended service. None of those later submissions managed to displace the Beretta design already in widespread service, and the M9 continued as America's standard sidearm for the following 3 decades, serving through the entirety of the Gulf War, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and every significant American military operation fought across that same extended span of continuous service, stretching from the late Cold War through more than 2 full decades of the global war on terror. This is not a story about a single pistol simply winning a straightforward competition on its own individual merits, since the actual path to the M9's own eventual adoption involved genuine institutional secrecy, a real safety controversy requiring an emergency engineering fix, and considerable public suspicion that the Army itself had once tried quietly sabotaging its own testing process, specifically to avoid replacing a weapon it had personally grown attached to across decades of prior service. It is a story about how thoroughly a pistol's own actual documented performance can diverge from its own popular reputation, a design that measurably outperformed its own beloved predecessor by a considerable margin, still spending decades fighting a genuine, occasionally justified controversy that never actually reflected what the Army's own formal testing data had already proven years before the weapon ever reached a single soldier's own holster in the field. Beyond the raw reliability numbers, the Beretta design also offered genuine, measurable capability improvements soldiers actually noticed once they started training with it regularly. The M9's own 15-round magazine capacity nearly doubled the M1911's own 7-round capacity, meaning a soldier carrying the same number of spare magazines suddenly had access to considerably more rounds before needing to reload during an actual engagement, a genuinely significant tactical advantage in exactly the kind of close-quarters, high-stress combat situations a sidearm actually gets used in, rather than the controlled range conditions where a smaller magazine capacity mattered considerably less. The double-action first-shot trigger the Beretta design incorporated also let a soldier safely carry the weapon with a round already chambered and the hammer down, a genuine safety improvement over the M1911's own single-action design, which traditionally required carrying the weapon cocked and locked, hammer back, safety engaged, a configuration plenty of soldiers found genuinely uncomfortable trusting around their own body during ordinary daily carry, regardless of how reliable the mechanical safety itself actually was. The M1911's own genuine, legendary status made replacing it a considerably harder institutional and cultural project than swapping out any ordinary piece of equipment, since the pistol had already served American forces continuously since 1911 itself, spanning both world wars, Korea and Vietnam, across nearly 74 years of continuous American military service before the M9 ever actually took over its own role. That kind of accumulated institutional and emotional attachment, built across multiple, entirely separate generations of American soldiers who had each personally trusted the same basic design in genuine combat, genuinely complicated any purely objective replacement process from the very beginning, regardless of how much the underlying 9mm cartridge and the Beretta's own more modern design might have actually improved on the original weapon's own documented reliability and ammunition capacity. Critics who dismissed the M9 specifically because it was not the M1911 were, in a genuine sense, responding to that same emotional attachment rather than to anything the Army's own actual testing data had ever really supported, once both pistols were actually measured side by side under identical conditions during the exact same formal trial process. The Army officially began replacing the M9 with the SIG Sauer M17 and M18 starting in 2017, closing out a run of standard American military service stretching back to 1985, more than 30 years spent as the sidearm every American officer and enlisted soldier actually carried, a genuinely long tenure for a weapon whose own adoption had been contested at nearly every single step along the way before it ever actually earned that same lasting trust in the field. That transition itself proceeded considerably more gradually than the M9's own original adoption ever had, older Beretta pistols remaining in active use across various reserve, training, and support roles for years after the newer SIG Sauer design had already begun reaching frontline units, a genuinely fitting final chapter for a weapon whose own entire service history had already been defined by exactly this kind of extended, incremental transition rather than any single dramatic changeover moment. If you want more stories about the weapons that won the argument only after they had already won the war, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.